All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We are really excited about today's presentation and are so incredibly grateful to Dan Cullinan, who's a research associate at MDRC, who is going to share his knowledge and expertise around program evaluation, but using the economic lens. So I know that this is important for all of us to really think about the financial implications of programs and things such as cost benefit and cost analysis. So Dan will share some resources he already has in the chat, and he'll tell you about those in a moment, as well as sharing just kind of some general background knowledge. It's going to really help you as you move forward with your program evaluation dissertation. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you don't mind, would you mind just telling everyone a little bit about MDRC maybe to get us started, and then go ahead and start the presentation. And if you want folks to unmute to ask questions along the way, or you wanted them to wait till the end, just let them know.
Okay, great. Yeah. So as far as questions go, I think if you have a burning question as we go through, that's probably the best time to ask. But I'll also have hopefully a little time at the end as well. So that's up to you. We can, and if it seems like I'm not going to get through the slides, we can then hold questions to the end. So MDRC is a social policy research organization that has been around for about 40 years. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that really studies how to help low-income people in different policy areas, and so that could include families and children, K through 12 education, workforce-related, or in what I'm going to talk about today, post-secondary education. And we're known for doing randomized controlled trials, but that includes program evaluation, demonstrations, but we also do all kinds of qualitative and quantitative analysis and research besides that. And so today I'm going to talk about some really good cost analysis materials that IES developed based on work by Hank Levin, Brooks Bowden, and Clive Belfield and others at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education. But I'm going to intersperse it with examples from MDRC research that I've been involved with. So without further ado, just start with the basics here. Costs are the value of all the resources used to implement a program that you are evaluating. And these costs represent opportunity costs, sacrifices of resources could have been used for another purpose. And resources, that's human time and energy, labor, also buildings, equipment, anything that's used. And of particular interest are the resources used in the implementation of the program that would not have been used otherwise, but we often want to look at the status quo resource use as well. And the values are quantified by prices. So that can be easy, like market prices, like how much does this thing cost on Amazon, or how much does someone typically get paid who does this? Or it can be a little more complicated, and that's when you do something called shadow pricing. And so I'm going to walk through the structure, really an excellent checklist of the cost analysis starter kit, and kind of step by step, and as I said, show you some examples. So the first step in the process of evaluating or analyzing cost for a program evaluation is to make sure you understand what that program is. What is the theory of change? And I know that's something you guys have been working on. I saw in your syllabus. And it's great because it's important to understand the theory of change and logic model in order to do a good cost analysis so that you can be aware of what the inputs are and what the activities are. These are two big sources of cost. But it also works the other way around. By having to kind of methodically go through these inputs and activities in order to quantify costs, you come to a better understanding of the implementation of the program. So this is really part of implementation research, and I think viewing it that way is a way to kind of communicate both to funders or to your fellow researchers or to practitioners the importance of this cost work and the relevance of it. Now, this is not a traditional logic model, but I thought it was a pretty good visual representation of some of the inputs and activities and desired outcomes that wanted to change for the accelerated studies and associate programs, which was a CUNY program to help students graduate. And it was very successful. It's one of the more successful programs we've studied at MDRC. And so we did a study of that a few years ago. And this visual kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that might be considered in the cost of such a program. There's tuition waivers and the free use of textbooks and a transit card, Metro card. So these things are pretty straightforward. They're going to have a pretty clear cost, like how much was the tuition waiver, right? How much was the value of the textbooks, and how much did each Metro card have on it, and how many were distributed, right? And the goal here is to relieve some of the financial burdens. Now, there's also a bunch of student services in this bundle of ASAP intervention, and this is highly personalized, high-touch advising, individual career employment support, and tutoring. Now, all these things are going to have costs associated with the amount of time and the qualifications of the people doing these things. Then there's course enrollment aspects of this. Students are really encouraged to go ahead and get into their courses if they need to take a developmental course, or if they need to enroll full-time. That's one of the requirements of the program. These things are going to have indirect costs on the number of courses a student takes, and so, you know, if this is scaled, the number of courses the university offers. And the blocked course scheduling, if that were implemented, is going to take up some registrar time. You know, that's a structural change that an institution would have to make. So these are all things that need to be captured in the cost analysis. So when you're doing any cost analysis, the next step is to choose the perspective. This one's really important in education, I think, because, I mean, it's always important, but I found that really colleges have one perspective that is not always representative of all the costs of the program. It's not always representative of the societal costs. But because colleges are implementing these programs and are often bearing a lot of the direct costs of the program, their perspective is important, and you probably want to always keep it in mind and have it presented in a cost analysis. But other perspectives include government, how much government additional aid would be spent on this or other government transfers. The student, you know, if the student is going to be spending extra time or even money to be part of a program. And then the societal cost is everything. It's all of the above. So once you start thinking about these different perspectives, I thought this was a really important sentence. So I quoted the whole thing. And this is from Hank Levin's textbook, Educational Evaluation, Economic Evaluation in Education. And the various constituencies may provide cash contributions or subsidies to the sponsoring school district. These transactions serve to create subsidies or cash transfers for some constituencies to the sponsoring school district. Such subsidies will reduce the net cost to the school districts and increase the cost to other constituencies. So when you're doing these perspectives, this is very important, because if it's not a societal perspective, these transfers will really change the cost, depending on the perspective. But it's always important to keep in mind from the societal perspective that these aren't ingredients or costs. It's just a question of who's paying it. And you can have several transfers happening in different directions, and it can become a little bit confusing. So the key is just not to double count. So for example, a student pays tuition, but that tuition is coming from a combination of federal student aid, state and local student aid or grants, and then possibly the student's own pocket. At the end of the day, the resources used to offer the courses that the student take are the same, no matter how many different transfers go into funding the offering of those courses. But your perspective will really change the cost that you present for any given party. So the next step in this is to identify the quantity and quality of the program's key ingredients. And this is a data collection process. And there are several different ways to go about collecting these data. Interviews are one way to go about it. I would say that if you're going to do interviews, it's good to do them somewhat more than at the end of the program. So if it's a several-year program, you don't want to wait till year 3 and then say, now tell me about the first 6 months, how no one's going to remember. So it's good to get in there kind of early and talk to people about how much time they're spending on things. Typical ingredient time, I think, in educational programs is usually number 1. It's staff time, it's faculty time, it's administrator time. Other things could be space used. If it's an intervention that's using space that's not part of a normal day-to-day course taking. Any equipment, if there are special tests or assessments being used, these things may be proprietary and have a cost. And you want to kind of keep track of all these details. And then also think about if there are induced behaviors, what is the cost associated with that? Can I just ask folks to mute if you don't mind until you have a question, and just unmute if you have a question. Thank you. So this is an example of a really great beginning to the question of ASAP implementation research that also includes some really valuable information for our cost analysis. So right off the bat, full-time enrollment is required in the ASAP program. It's not required under the usual college services. That is going to induce students to enroll full-time, which means there are going to be costs associated with that. If they're induced to take developmental courses early, that's going to be probably offering more developmental courses. And then whatever it is a student's doing, if you're doing a student perspective, they're spending more time in these courses. They may be spending more time commuting to and from the campus if they're taking more courses, more time doing homework. So if you're doing a full societal perspective or student perspective, these are all things you want to quantify. Now, again, that may not have a clear market price, but we can come back to how you would go about getting a shadow price. So for student services, the ratio of student to advisor is being cut down by like an order of magnitude here for the program group. So there you go. That's going to be more advisors in order to provide this level of service to students. Same with career services. You have 80% of students meeting with career service advisors as opposed to only about 30% in the control group. That's going to be a cost that needs to be accounted for, those people's time. Tutoring as well, more tutoring time. Blocked or linked courses, as I mentioned earlier. Now here's an interesting wrinkle. If that were to have been implemented as intended, that would have been registrar time that needed to be accounted for. But it turns out that upon looking at the implementation, it didn't really get implemented. There's not really the contrast there that was intended. But what you want to do as a cost analyst is quantify the resources actually used, because when you're looking at the impacts from whatever your impact evaluation is for this program, it's not going to be the impacts if it had gone perfectly. It's going to be the impacts as implemented. And so you want the cost to also be as implemented, so that if someone says, well, you got these impacts on this program, how do I get those impacts? Well, it's good for them to know we actually didn't really get around to doing the blocked and linked courses as intended. They're not going to have to spend the full cost on that to get the impacts that you generated. Finally, the tuition waiver, metro cards, and use of textbook, as I mentioned, that's pretty straightforward, just getting the counts right on that, who got how many of what, and those have clear values. Okay, so step 4, you've kind of quantified all these things that happened. Now you have to price them. This is where the tool cost out that I shared the link for really comes in handy. It has all kinds of price data, and you want to consider where you want to use national price data, local price data, or both, and that's going to depend on your audience. And you want to make sure that whatever units you use are appropriate for the quantity that you're actually trying to represent your analysis. And so an example of that is when you go into cost out, you can tell it, well, it may have calendar year salary or academic year salary. And so depending on which it is, that's a different number of hours that went into that salary. And so you want to make sure that whatever it is that actually happened in your program is that number, the salary is for that number of hours. It's also important if you know somebody spent half their time on something, or if they spent a certain number of hours on something, you have to know the denominator out of what in order to get a fraction of that salary. And the cost out tool is really great. I mean, if you go up, that's the link there, but there's the quick start, which just kind of gets you going with it. The manual is really in depth. It gives you all the options, all the formulas, all the different pages you can use. And yes, it is free to use cost out. And sorry, I haven't really been paying attention to the comments, but I will try to pay more attention. Yes, free to use, free registration. And there's tutorials, there's video tutorials, there's PDF tutorials for different aspects of it. I think one of the most useful things, I mean, you can do an entire cost analysis and cost out, like everything, keeping track of all your data, doing all the calculations, even generating some tables. You don't have to, though. You can just go in and click prices, and it gives you kind of a list of education-related prices for equipment, space, staff, different consulting, faculty, administrators, even volunteer. There's shadow prices for volunteer time. So yeah, if nothing else, I would check out the price list, and you can get that for state and national. All right, let's see. So an example of why you would care about national versus local, again, from the ASAP program, is that the ASAP New York program was much more expensive than the ASAP replication in Ohio. And there were a number of reasons for this, but clearly one of those is that local prices are lower in Ohio. So if you are okay with presenting local prices, that's one thing, but it's always important to keep in mind if you're going to start comparing ASAP New York to ASAP Ohio, that like one of the differences was that New York is just a more expensive place to run a program. Similarly, space at a college or student time or volunteer time, as I mentioned, doesn't have a market price, and it's kind of hard to just look up a salary. So I think the question is, this can become a little contentious depending, on the perspective of the data provider. So colleges may not feel like these are particularly important things to cost because they didn't have to pay for them. They had the space, they had the volunteers or the students show up. And I think the questions really you want to ask are, could you have replicated the program without these components? you know, if you had volunteers doing the program and they were just absolutely essential, if they had not shown up, the program wouldn't have worked, then you're going to need to find a way to price that volunteer time. And the cost out tool can help you with that. And then the other question is, what is the perspective? I mean, if you are just doing a college perspective and that's all, you might be able to make the case that you don't need to really include these costs. But even if it is the college's perspective, you want to ask yourself, would all colleges have these things for free? And that's not always true. So some colleges might have access to a volunteer pool that other colleges wouldn't necessarily, or have a bunch of space sitting around that another college wouldn't. So still worth pricing out in those cases. And as always, if it's a societal perspective, it really is important.
Dan, I don't know if you want to take these questions now, but there are 2 questions in the chat. One is,
okay.
Is there a way to adjust the prices for regions?
Yes. So you can get different prices for different regions from the cost out tool, as well as from BLS and others. And I think you can even do some sort of an adjustment from regional to national and vice versa. I believe there may be information about that in the cost out tool itself, but I'll follow up on that afterwards.
Great. And then the other one is, can you use the rental fee that a college would charge someone else to use that space as the price?
So this is an excellent question. The answer is probably not, because the problem is that these college spaces aren't really part of normal rental markets. And while they may have a fee they charge for use of their space, it's often not something just anyone does. It's not just like I want to rent that, you know, to use for whatever purpose, whenever. Now, if it is something that's widely used, constantly rented out, you could probably just use that fee. But if it's a rare kind of once in a while they rent it out, the way that cost out and the CPCSE recommends going about it is actually just calculating, and cost out will do this for you, the construction costs of an equivalent space, and then amortizing it over the life of its use, which is like 30 years or more. And then, you know, it's a small fraction of the cost of that space per year. And then you're just going to use whatever proportion of that's actually used for the program. So although it sounds like, wait, that's going to be really expensive to pretend we're building new space, by the time you amortize it over the entire life of the space, and then you just use the fraction of it that's for that program, it actually gives you a pretty good shadow price. Yeah, and I will agree that if you use the space regularly, it's going to it depends on how much you're using it and everything else, and how much it's rented out. But ideally, if you amortize it correctly, it's not going to be that different from market rental prices. That's kind of how a lot of those things are determined, depending on location and everything else. But 30 years, yeah. Oh wait, there are a few other things here. So we already talked about geographic a little bit. I want to give a few examples of amortized, joint, and present value calculations from a really good resource that MDRC produced years ago by David Greenberg. And it's in the references of this slideshow. It's the title is slipping my mind, but it's a cost publication from MDRC that's in this slideshow. So let me go to the next one. Straight line depreciation. If you have to buy a big piece of equipment at the beginning of a program, and you know you're going to sell it, it's a 5-year program, and then you're going to sell it. So say you expect to spend 50,000 on it and then sell it for 10,000 after 5 years, it's going to be 8,000 per year. Very straightforward way to assign costs to big capital purchases for program use. And then it's important to keep in mind joint costs. If it's not going to be just used for the program, really straightforward, you figure out how much of the time in each year it's going to be used for the program and multiply it by that fraction. The other thing you want to do, obviously, is discounting. I mean, if you have program costs 3 years out, the present value of those is much lower. And for education, the CBCSE recommends using 3.5% discount rate. Sometimes people use 3%. And this particular example just gives you, what would happen if they're using a 5% discount rate, and if they just summed it across the years, they get 3,600,000. If they discount it appropriately, it's over $300,000 less. So it's just an important detail to remember. Let's see, I had another chat here. Yeah, I think straight line depreciation, definitely. College finance would be familiar with that. But that raises another really good point, which is if you are going to use budget information from a college to get these prices, you want to ask them questions like that. Also, are they including overhead in their salaries? Are they including fringe benefits? Because the true price is, of course, greater than the salary. And an inflation adjustment, again, it's just easy, but it's one of those details you don't want to forget. So after you've depreciated everything back to the first year of the program, if you're doing that retrospectively, and that first year of the program was in the past, you just want to adjust for inflation to current years if doing it for a report or something. And while this gives a CPI example, you obviously can just Google inflation calculator now, and it's really easy. So now you have all this information on resources, ingredients, quantities of those things and their prices, and how to do the adjustments. How do you go about presenting all this? Usually in education, people are interested in the total cost, often interested in the cost per participant, breakdown by ingredient category. If you're doing a societal analysis, you want to break it down by payer to some extent, and then also kind of addressing if it's over multiple years. So this is an example of a table we did for the ASAP replication in Ohio. And it does some of the things just mentioned. You see, these are direct costs, so incremental costs above and beyond the status quo that were directly program related. So it doesn't get into things like additional courses attempted or anything in this table. There were the three big things: administration and staffing, student services, financial support, and each of those is broken out into separate categories. We have an average cost per year here over 3 years. So we didn't break every year out into unique cost. We just sort of gave an average per year, but we also give the total cost over 3 years. And then we have percentages of that, which is a nice little piece of information for policymakers. So you've done your cost analysis, and now it's time to do a sensitivity analysis. And I think being transparent about your assumptions is one of the most important things in a cost analysis, because you have to make assumptions. There's almost no way to do these cost analyses without making some assumptions. And so you just have to say what those are. And some readers will accept those, and others will say, I don't agree with these assumptions. You want to try to guess ahead of time a little bit which ones might be the most contentious and which ones might be the most consequential in terms of your bottom line estimate. Often that's going to be labor. I'm going to give you an example of sensitivity analysis that we often do in our studies at MDRC, and that's trying to come up with an estimate of what the marginal cost of offering additional courses to students who are induced to take more courses is. So if you ask the college, they'll often say it's zero. We already have the teachers, we already have the classes, bring more students, no problem. And they also say that because they do get revenue from students. But from a societal perspective, you know, the revenue is just a transfer. There are resources being used to offer additional courses to additional students. Now, it may not kick in with one student. And so these examples that, and again, this is from David Greenberg's book, which is in the references, an MDRC publication. This gives some examples of when marginal cost might be less than average cost. And average cost is easy, it's just cost per participant of the program, or cost per person offered the program. And if it's like equipment or space that they were going to be using anyway, or administrators that were going to have to be working on something anyway, and then you add a few more students and they don't have to buy more of those things or pay more people to do those things, you have a marginal cost that's practically zero. If, on the other hand, you get so many more students enrolling that you have to offer new course sections and maybe even hire new faculty, your marginal cost actually could be greater than the average cost all of a sudden. And so when we did this analysis, we took kind of a range we were comfortable with. And so that range was marginal cost equal to average cost, which is just to say whatever it costs to educate students, you know, you on average, you have to add that again for each new student enrolling, taking more credits. And we get that information from the NCES IPEDS database, which I really recommend checking out as well. It has a lot of good cost per credit, cost of attendance type information in there. The other assumption was just there is no marginal cost. That's the one the colleges tend to like. And we do estimates of each and then just kind of take the middle ground. And so that's a happy compromise. But this is an example of a sensitivity analysis. So now you have your cost analysis done and you've done sensitivity analysis. And so is there something more you want to do? I mean, the cost analysis itself is quite interesting and useful, but if you have a rigorous evaluation with impact estimates, you can go a little further. I mean, the cost feasibility one is really, it's just a question of taking your costs and asking the college if that's more or less than their budget. That's pretty easy. For cost effectiveness, if you have causal estimates of primary outcomes like graduations or completing a certain number of course credits, it's pretty simple to just take the impact that the program had and divide the cost by that. So the incremental cost. So that could be the net cost of the program, including direct costs and indirect costs, divided by whatever the impact was on the outcome of interest. And so you may find that this is better or worse than the status quo if you have status quo cost numbers, but you don't even need that to do this analysis. If all you have is the incremental cost of the program, you can just take the impact and use that to find out cost effectiveness. Now, the limitation being, you might want to have something to compare that to. And so if you're not doing status quo costs, you would want to possibly compare that to other programs that did a cost effectiveness analysis on the same outcome. We do the cost effectiveness analysis quite regularly at MDRC. The next one being cost benefit is a much bigger undertaking because you have to monetize all the benefits of the program, all the induced costs, but going beyond that to what would this do to employment, what would it do to prison rates, what would it do to taxes? And so you have to make a lot of assumptions to do that. But I would argue that it's worth doing in many cases, because so often the cost effectiveness won't tell the whole story. There may be benefits to society that you wouldn't know just by looking at, how much it costs to get a given outcome. I mean, for example, it could be, it costs way more to get additional degrees than it does in the status quo, right? From your cost effectiveness. But it turns out those additional degrees are worth so much more than that additional cost that it's still worthwhile. And you would only learn that from a benefit cost analysis. So here's an example of a cost effectiveness table from our ASAP replication. We were able to calculate cost for the status quo using the IPEDS data I mentioned, and the number of courses attempted by students in the control group. And so that was about $19,000 over 3 years. By the time you include the direct and indirect costs of the ASAP replication, it was about $8,000 more. Let's see what we got here. Question was, how can we use the cost benefit to measure social justice impact of a program? And how can you estimate the benefits in a place where it's never been used or tried? So for the social justice question, I think you would want to look at outcomes that are closely related to social justice program goals. So things like imprisonment rates, things like employment and income. So it's a matter of defining your outcomes, I think, and making sure that those get monetized appropriately by the effects of the program. Now, the question about if it's never been tried, it's going to be difficult to do a benefit cost on something that hasn't been tried and evaluated. Usually you're working from some kind of impact on some kind of observable outcome that then can be used to make assumptions about either longer term outcomes or related outcomes that you may or may not be able to measure. So, for example, let's say you could measure the impact on degrees. Well, it would be great if you could also get employment data and look at that, because that would make it much more straightforward to estimate the benefit on income. But if you can't, you might be able to look at some research on what a degree does to income on average and use that as an assumption in your benefit analysis. You may look at other countries. I mean, it's a little tricky because the context is so different in another country that you might not be able to just kind of take what happened there and apply it to an American context. But you can make assumptions. I mean, again, at the end of the day, you're going to have to make some assumptions and put them out there and be transparent about them. And you will get feedback from people on whether or not they think those are realistic assumptions. And so that's when you might want to start saying, well, what if we made a different assumption and present a range of possible benefits, a range of possible costs in your sensitivity analysis. So just to finish up this table, you can see that the price per degree was actually lower than the status quo. I mean, this was really a success story for the ASAP and ASAP replication. It's just extraordinary that this additional tuition and advising and other supports, while they were costly, ended up dramatically lowering the cost per degree. And you know, people say, well, this is an expensive program, and it is, relatively speaking. But then when you look at it from this perspective, it doesn't seem so expensive anymore. And there are so many programs that are not that expensive that can't show you something like this. Okay, so this is why we do these analyses. It's really important. A little bit less of an impact on credits earned, but credits earned are not the primary outcome. They're sort of a secondary outcome here. The goal was to get more people to the degree. So here are my references. The top one is Cost Analysis Step by Step by David Greenberg. That's where all my examples that I pasted in about joint costs and straight line depreciation and other things came from. It's a really great resource. It's not education specific, but I think it still might be worth taking a look at. And then I've also referenced here the original CUNY ASAP evaluation MDRC 3-year results, as well as the ASAP replication in Ohio 3-year results. And then the textbook by Hank Levin, Economic Evaluation and Education, really excellent. The toolkit that we walk through step by step, and the cost out tool itself. So I have a few minutes left. There may be more questions. I also could change my screen to the cost out tool itself and just kind of scroll through some of the screens on there to show you what's available. I don't know if you have a preference or.
It looks like somebody said that would be great.
Okay.
Why don't you give that a whirl?
Okay. So I'm going to. Right. So this is my favorite. Can folks see that? Okay. This is my favorite screen on the cost toolkit. It's just great. It has all of these prices for all these different education related ingredients. So you see, I start out with the academic advisor, and you see here they have a unit of measure, calendar year or per hour. They have to the left, to the right, you can see what year it was. That's important for getting your present values correct. I'm just gonna. Okay, yeah. And they've got this, of course, for post-secondary and K through 12, I believe. Building. So this is giving you a square foot cost for facilities. And if you click on one of these, like, I think it gives you a little more information about how they came up with the number. So post-secondary academic building adjusted, median cost per square foot for construction uprated by 21% to include furniture, furnishing, fees, site preparation. And then so you could use this to come up with a cost of space use for a program by amortizing it. Okay. I mean, they've got, acetaminophen, administrative assistants. There's volunteer time here. If I go kind of down to the bottom, computer stuff, computer network. Yeah, so like volunteer. $25 an hour. you may want to adjust this depending on the population, and if it's student volunteer, maybe you're going to make the case that that's lower than that. The other nice thing is that for all these different salaries, it gives you guidance on benefits. So if I go up here to additional resources, database of benefit rates, and if you click that, it actually will give you a download Excel sheet that tells you what to multiply these salaries by to include benefits. All the formulas can be downloaded as well. A lot of these are similar to the ones I showed in my slideshow, but if you're just curious, and again, this is nice because you don't have to let Cost Out do it for you. Cost Out has so much great information. The interface can be a little clunky, so sometimes it's better just to go straight to like, okay, how are they doing this? And I can get the prices I need and do it myself quicker. And then as I mentioned, up here in tutorials, they've got videos and PDFs for how to actually interact with the interface. The manual is really in depth, but there's also like a quick start thing. It's another download. But you can create your own project. So you can see this project list. I've got like some projects in here, things I was working on, but there's also some demonstrations. So you click it, and you go to the project, and then you can break it down into sections. All right, so like, they've got, you put down here information about the objective, the subjects, the description, number of participants per year. Now, once you get your program evaluation information, impacts can be entered in here and the unit of measure. And then all your cost information. So they've got the ingredients, the quantity, whether it's a fixed or variable cost. And this is where they're saying, oh, well, the government's picking up the tab for this whole thing. None of it's from private organizations. None of it's from students. None of it's from the program sponsor. And if there were transfers and the rest, it would be noted here. So it's a great tool. I really recommend it. Let me see if I can just show you the iPads database as well. You're probably already familiar with this, but in case you're not, we use this a lot. So you can go in here to survey data. Access database. That's not the one I was looking for. Sorry. Okay, yeah, this is what I was looking for. So compare institutions. You can look up institutions by name. Here it is. Oh, New Jersey City University. And then go in and select variables for this. And they have institution characteristics, but we were using the finance data. This is kind of a pie chart version. You can also actually download by year tuition fees, state appropriations, different cost per credit, cost of attendance, and other things. So I'll stop there. Are there any other questions?
You can feel free to unmute if you have a question for Dan.
Yeah.
Probably be faster than you typing it out. So if you'd like to ask a question.
So I have just a general question and maybe or observation. So this is really a rich tools that you shared with our students, and obviously some of them as a in the program evaluation model that we're using will probably avail themselves to some of these tools. But I'm thinking about its usefulness outside of just this project, because I know some students were asking questions about the institutional reference point. So is this tool also used in grant development, to, when people are working on budgets, et cetera? I'm just from your experience.
The CBCSE tool or the cost out tool or the iPads?
The CBC tool.
Yeah. That's a great question. Yes, it could be. I mean, certainly if you're trying to come up with a budget, you could use that. I haven't used it that way myself, but it's possible.
Okay.
I have a question. How does the MDRC choose the projects that you're going to work on? I know you have a board there.
Yeah, that's so it's really a department by department development effort that involves in our interactions with the field, with practitioners, policymakers, administrators. In our research, we kind of understand what questions are unanswered and what it is that's of most interest to community colleges around the country. And then we take that information and develop proposals to funders, could be government or foundation funders, to research certain questions. So it's kind of an iterative process. We do some research, we learn what we don't know, we do some more research, we learn what we don't know, and we have quite a bit of dissemination and outreach ongoing to make sure that we're asking the right questions.
So do people ever come to you and say, this has been bothering, I'm working on this, and is this something that you look at this like individual ideas that come from people like us?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we're always happy to hear ideas. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't have any funds that are not project related, really. So, okay. Yeah. So, like, if we're going to work on something, we kind of get a proposal out and get it funded, and then, yeah. So it would be nice if we could just kind of work on what we wanted. If it doesn't work that way,
I'm interested in things like how replicable is this, this intervention or whatever it is that we're doing or I'm doing, because if I really, am behind this and I want to keep this going, and it seems to me that these numbers are really important to be able to sell this so that I can get grants for this or funding, because I would want to keep doing this if it had any chance at making a difference,
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether or not you guys came in that respect to try to help people with finding grantors for this kind of work.
Well,
maybe not.
No, we definitely produce reports that are intended to kind of give guidance on how to go about monitoring and evaluation and implementing different programs. But it doesn't sound like exactly what you have in mind.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We're probably going to get a course on that anyway.
Yeah.
Somewhere. Okay.
Next semester, Lynn, next semester you get to focus
Yeah.
on
Now
science.
this is very interesting though, because it's really, everybody needs to see the money. Everybody needs to see how much is this going to cost and what's the benefit, or it's not going to be replicated.
I mean, it's true. And back sort of to your previous point, I mean, the cost stuff becomes even more valuable if you do have a rigorous evaluation to go along with it.
Yeah.
Because that's when you can go beyond saying how much does this cost to saying, was it worth it? Yeah.
Well, from an operational perspective, I mean, often senior administrators don't even look at this stuff, and you'll have a president or vice presidents that are leading a division that will go on gut, right? And this is a good initiative. Let's fund it. Oh, let's put Martine in front of it. Lynn and Derek, they're good guys, and they may be effective, but then you find out, well, damn, Martine's making X money. Lynn's making X, Derek's making, wait a minute, was it really, and we helped 40 students, which, I think what this is kind of reminds us is that everything has a cost of decisions that we make. And too often, unless there's a crisis like right now we have, where budgets are being decimated because of COVID, low enrollment, that now, this tool, or this, at least this lens, I think has become increasingly important for leaders to have as some front and center, rather than sometimes kind of just having, oftentimes never even asking how much it's going to cost.
Absolutely, and it all goes back to if you have staff and faculty working on one thing, it's something else they're not doing, right? So it matters.
Right. And we had a conversation earlier today, Christine and I, with some I forget with a student or someone about guided pathways and its impact on implementation, and how now, because of what's going on, the institution is slowing down their movement in guided pathways, and that there may be legitimate reason in that person's mind, but there are costs all of a sudden, because you've already got sunken in, I don't know, X amount, $10 million in, and you decide that because of certain political issues that you're not going to move forward. Well, it's costing by, even if you just stay in a holding pattern, but that conversation often isn't spoken about explicitly. And again,
I know it can be really frustrating both ways. It's like, you can be wasting resources or using resources in not the most efficient manner, or on the other hand, there can be decisions made at the top about, well, we're not going to spend money on this, it's too expensive, when actually it would be well worth it from the perspective of the students, from the perspective of society. Sometimes even the college can benefit from these things. So it's tricky, because nobody wants to pay for something that doesn't directly benefit them from their perspective. And that's why we have to address perspectives in the work, but never lose sight of the societal part as well.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you. It is the top of the hour, so I want to be respectful of your time, and I know all of our students are also going to have to get back to their full-time jobs as well. So thanks for joining us on a lunch break, hopefully. And Dan, the work that you're doing at MDRC and all of your colleagues, I mean, we're just in awe of it, and we congratulate you on making such a difference to the field. I know I'm always, every time a new report comes out, I'm eager to read it and learn from it, and I know our students are too. And now you've just given us a great backdrop for our conversations that will be coming related to the economic lens that we're going to use for our program evaluation framework. And it's a really important element, as we've all been discussing. And it's outside of many of our comfort zones if it's not something that you've done all the time. I know some of you, this is kind of your space, and others it's not. But we're all going to learn at least the basics of it so that we can make good informed decisions, not just from a outcome and impact perspective, but also from the cost lens as well.
I want this to become my language. Like, I want this to be part of my knowledge. I'm sitting here being like, what? So Christine mentioning backdrop is good. So at least I've got notes. So thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I really appreciated this opportunity. It was a great exercise for me to make this this presentation, and I wish you all the best of luck in your studies, and maybe next year I'll be back.
Awesome.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. All right, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.